Moving into my new Texas ranch, I was ready for wide open spaces and peaceful living. Instead, I unearthed something that shattered that peace. A note, meticulously hidden, that points to an unsettling truth about this land. What was written on it has changed everything I thought I knew about my new home. The ranch stretched before me like a painting of forgotten America. 300 acres of sun-bleached grass, mesquite trees twisted into arthritic shapes, and a sky so vast it seemed to swallow sound itself. I'd bought the property sight unseen at an estate auction, lured by the price that seemed too good to be true. Standing there that first morning, watching dust devils dance across the empty pastures, I convinced myself I'd made a smart investment. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper with character. What she hadn't mentioned was the silence. Not peaceful silence, but the heavy, oppressive kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you strain to hear something, anything, to confirm you haven't gone deaf. The main house was a weathered two-story structure, its white paint peeling like sunburned skin. Victorian architecture gone to seed in the unforgiving Texas heat. I'd planned to renovate slowly, room by room, making it livable while respecting whatever history these walls held. My first week involved the unglamorous work of cleaning decades of accumulated grime, hauling out furniture too far gone to salvage, and trying to coax the ancient plumbing into cooperation. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Hartwell, had died alone here. Her distant nephew handled the estate sale and seemed eager to be rid of the place, practically shoving the keys into my hand before speeding away in his rental car. I started with the kitchen, scrubbing grease from the vintage stove and emptying cabinets filled with canned goods from the 1980s. The work was meditative in its monotony. Scrub, rinse, repeat. I found the usual detritus of a long life lived in one place. Expired spices, mismatched dishes, drawer organizers filled with rubber bands and twist ties. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that suggested I should turn around and leave while I still could. The pantry was a narrow walk-in closet lined with warped wooden shelves. Most of the foodstuffs had been cleared out by the estate sale company, leaving behind only the items too mundane or expired to bother with. I was pulling the shelves down to replace them when my crowbar slipped, gouging into the back wall with a hollow thunk that didn't match the solid construction of the rest of the house. I stopped, pressing my palm against the painted wood. Definitely hollow. My contractor's instinct kicked in immediately. A false wall, probably hiding old pipes or electrical work that didn't meet code. I worked the crowbar into the gap I'd created, applying steady pressure until the board popped free with a groan of ancient nails surrendering their grip. Behind it, instead of dusty plumbing, there was a shallow cavity carved directly into the wall studs. And inside that cavity, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag yellowed with age, was a folded piece of paper. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it free. The bag crinkled loudly in the silent house, a sound that seemed unnaturally intrusive. I carried the package to the kitchen table, where afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes I disturbed. The plastic bag bore the faded logo of a grocery chain I didn't recognize. Inside, the paper had been folded into a tight square, its edges sharp and precise. I unfolded it carefully, half expecting it to crumble, but the paper held together. It was thick stock, the kind used for important documents, now aged to the color of weak tea. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical in its uniformity, written in black ink that had faded to sepia. But it was the content that made my breath catch in my throat. Rules for 447, Whiskey Creek Road. Read the title, underlined twice. Below it, a numbered list. Never go to the south pasture after sunset. If you hear singing from that direction, close all windows and stay indoors until dawn. The well behind the barn is sealed for a reason. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to open it or draw water from it. If you find dead cattle arranged in a circle, burn them immediately. Do not touch them with bare hands. Do not call the authorities. Thomas Brennan is not welcome on this property. If someone claiming this name appears, do not invite them inside. Do not speak to them. Leave immediately and do not return until 3 days have passed. Every third Thursday, leave a jar of honey on the back porch step before midnight. Use raw, unfiltered honey only. The cellar door stays locked. You do not have the key. You should not seek the key. Nothing good remains down there. If the kitchen faucet runs red, let it run for exactly 7 minutes before using the water again. Do not investigate the source. Children's laughter heard when no children are present means you should leave the property for 24 hours minimum. The previous owners are buried on the property. Show respect. They're still watching. These rules exist for your protection. Previous residents who ignored them are no longer here to warn you. I read the list 3 times, each pass filling me with a different emotion. First, disbelief. Surely this was a joke, some elaborate prank left by the previous owner or found by her from the owner before. Second, confusion. The specificity of the rules suggested they weren't entirely fabrication. Why mention Whiskey Creek Road by address? Why name Thomas Brennan specifically? Third, and most unsettling, was the creeping sensation of recognition. The south pasture. I'd walked through it yesterday, admiring the view as the sun set behind the hills. I'd lingered there, enjoying the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, thinking how peaceful it felt. The memory now felt contaminated, as if I had unknowingly walked through a graveyard. The well behind the barn. I noticed it my first day here, an old stone structure with a heavy wooden cover held down by a rusted chain and padlock. I'd assumed it was sealed for safety reasons, to prevent animals or careless visitors from falling in. Now the word sealed took on a more ominous weight. What was being kept down there? Or was something being kept from getting out? I set the note down, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. The refrigerator's hum had stopped. Outside, no birds sang. Even the ever-present Texas wind seemed to have died, leaving the world perfectly still. I walked to the back door and looked out toward the barn, visible in the distance as a dark shape against the golden afternoon. The well was there, waiting. I'd always been waiting. Behind me, from somewhere deep in the house, came the sound of water running through pipes. I turned slowly, my heart accelerating. The kitchen faucet was off. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the bathroom I hadn't yet cleaned. The pipes groaned and shuddered, a rhythmic pulsing that sounded almost like breathing. Then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the note on the table behind me. 10 rules I didn't want to believe in but couldn't quite dismiss. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs that no longer felt like ordinary structural sounds. They felt like a language I didn't yet understand, but was beginning to recognize. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, painting the ranch in shades of amber and shadow. I had maybe 2 hours until sunset, 2 hours before I need to decide whether to follow rule number 1, or convince myself that it was all nonsense left by a disturbed mind. But even as I tried to rationalize it away, I found myself checking the windows, making sure they were locked, noting which ones faced south. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, past the rational explanations and civilized skepticism, a more primitive part of my brain was screaming a simple truth. Rules this specific aren't written as jokes. They're written in blood, or in the terrible knowledge that comes from witnessing something that rewrites your understanding of what's possible. I picked up the note again, studying the handwriting for any sign of madness or deception. But there was none, just careful, methodical instructions from someone who needed future residents to know what I was now beginning to suspect. That 447, Whiskey Creek Road, wasn't just a ranch. It was something else entirely, something that demanded respect, caution, and absolute adherence to rules I was only now beginning to comprehend. As darkness crept across the Texas plains, I made my first decision. I would follow rule number 1. I would close the windows facing south, and I would listen. Because if there was even a chance that these rules were based in reality, I needed to know what I was dealing with. And because in the growing shadows of my new home, I was starting to understand that some mysteries don't invite investigation. They demand survival. That first night, I sat at the kitchen table with the note spread before me and my laptop glowing in the darkness. I'd closed every south-facing window as the sun touched the horizon, turning the locks with hands that I refused to acknowledge were shaking. Now, with the house sealed and night pressing against the glass, I began my research in earnest. The address was correct. 447 Whiskey Creek Road. That much I could verify from my deed. But when I searched for the property's history, the results were frustratingly sparse. County records showed the land had been surveyed in 1867, part of a larger parcel granted to Confederate veterans after the Civil War. The original homesteader was listed as Josiah Brennan, and I felt my stomach drop at the surname. Thomas Brennan, rule number 4. The connection couldn't be coincidental. I dove deeper, following breadcrumb trails through digitized archives and genealogy websites. Josiah Brennan had been a captain in Hood's Texas Brigade, returning home after the war to claim his land grant. He built the original structure, a smaller house than what stood now, and established a cattle operation. Records showed he'd married in 1869 to a woman named Eleanor McKinney. They'd had 4 children: Thomas, William, Rebecca, and Margaret. Thomas. The name appeared in census record from 1870 and 1880, then disappeared entirely. No death certificate, no mention in later documents. He'd simply vanished from the historical record somewhere around 1884, when he would have been about 23 years old. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. What had Thomas Brennan done to warrant a warning that still echoed more than a century later? The well presented another puzzle. I found mentions of it in various property surveys and old letters preserved in county archives. One letter, dated 1891 and written by William Brennan to a cousin in Houston, mentioned the incident with the well and advised that it had been properly sealed by the Reverend. No details about what incident required a Reverend's involvement or why a well would need religious sanctification. Just that cryptic line, and then the subject changed to cattle prices. I was so absorbed in my research that I almost didn't notice when the sound started. It began as a low hum, barely audible over the laptop's fan. Then it resolved into something more distinct, a voice or voices, rising and falling in a melodic pattern. Singing, coming from the south. My blood turned to ice water. I closed the laptop, plunging the kitchen into darkness, and listened. The singing was clearer now, multiple voices harmonizing in a tune I didn't recognize. It wasn't English. The words were in some language I couldn't identify, syllables that seemed to catch and twist in ways human mouths shouldn't produce. The melody was beautiful and utterly wrong, like hearing a lullaby played backwards. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as the singing continued. It wasn't coming closer, but it wasn't fading either. It simply existed out there in the darkness, patient and persistent. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 30. Time became elastic in that lightless kitchen, measured only by the steady rhythm of my heartbeat and the otherworldly voices drifting across the pasture. Then, as abruptly as it began, the singing stopped. The silence that followed felt thick, oppressive. I waited another hour before turning the lights back on, and when I did, my reflection in the darkened window startled me. I looked haunted. I felt haunted. Sleep was impossible that night. I spent the hours until dawn cataloging every detail I could find about the property, building a timeline that grew more disturbing with each entry. In 1902, Eleanor Brennan had died under circumstances the death certificate listed as accidental drowning. despite the fact that there were no bodies of water on the property except the well. The same well that was now sealed. In 1918, during the influenza pandemic, 3 families had lived on the ranch simultaneously as tenant farmers. All 3 families had left within a 6-month period, abandoning their contracts and belongings. One farmer's diary, donated to the County Historical Society by a descendant, contained a single cryptic entry from his final week there. The honey keeps them calm. We've run out. God help us. The honey. Rule number 5. Every 3rd Thursday, leave a jar of raw honey on the back porch. For what? For whom? I found reference to a fire in 1934 that destroyed the original barn. The investigating sheriff's report noted suspicious circumstances and mentioned finding arranged remains of livestock, but concluded the fire was likely caused by lightning. No arrests were made. No further investigation conducted. Just another mystery added to the property's growing list. As dawn finally broke, painting the ranch in shades of pearl and rose, I felt the tension that had gripped me all night begin to loosen. I made coffee with hands that had steadied overnight, though I couldn't bring myself to use the kitchen tap. I used bottled water instead, unwilling to test rule number 7 on my first full day. The note lay on the table where I'd left it, innocuous in the morning light. But my research had transformed it from a curious artifact into a map of catastrophes. Each rule corresponded to something real, something documented, even if the records had been sanitized or the truth obscured by official language and deliberate vagueness. I needed to talk to someone local, someone who might remember the stories that hadn't made it into official records. The kind of oral history that gets passed down through families and shared in whispers at church socials. I thought of the cashier at the feed store where I'd stopped on my way into town, an elderly woman who'd given me a strange look when I mentioned my address. At the time, I dismissed it. Now I wondered what she knew. But first, I needed to see the well in daylight. Rule number 2 said not to open it or draw water from it, but it didn't say I couldn't examine it. I needed to understand what I was dealing with, even if that understanding came with a price. I walked out into the morning, the grass crunching under my boots, still crisp with dew. The barn loomed ahead, its red paint faded to rust. Behind it, partially hidden by tall weeds, stood the well. It was exactly as I remembered. A circular stone structure about 4 feet high, topped with heavy wooden planks held down by a chain and padlock. But in the daylight, I could see details I'd missed before. The stones weren't just old, they were covered in carvings, worn smooth by weather and time, but still visible when I knelt close. Symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in concentric circles around the well circumference. Some looked vaguely religious, crosses and stars. Others were more abstract, geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long, as if they'd been designed to confuse the eye. The padlock was industrial strength, the kind used for storage units, and relatively new. Someone had been maintaining this seal, replacing the lock when necessary. Dorothy Hartwell, the previous owner, must have taken the rules seriously. I wondered if she'd written the note, or if she'd found it just as I had, hidden by whoever came before her. I placed my hand on the stone, feeling its coolness even through the morning heat. The rock was solid, unyielding, ancient, but beneath my palm, I swear I felt something. A vibration, so faint it might have been my imagination. A pulse, like a heartbeat from deep underground. I jerked my hand back and stood, suddenly aware of how isolated I was out here, how far from the house, how alone. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Scratched into the wooden cover, barely visible under years of weathering, were words. Rebecca Brennan, 1884. God forgive us. I photographed it with my phone, my hand shaking again. Rebecca, one of Josiah's daughters. What had happened in 1884? What had they done that required God's forgiveness? And why was her name carved into a well that supposedly held nothing but water? Walking back to the house, I felt the weight of the ranch pressing down on me. Every structure, Every tree, every blade of grass seemed to hold secrets. The land itself felt aware, watching my clumsy attempts to understand its history with patient amusement. I was an outsider here, stumbling through a narrative that had been written in blood and tears long before I arrived. Inside, I made a list of my findings, trying to organize the chaos into something coherent. 1867. Land granted to Josiah Brennan, 1884. Thomas Brennan disappears. Rebecca Brennan connected to well incident, 1891. Well sealed by Reverend, 1902. Eleanor Brennan drowns in the well. 1918. Tenant farmers flee after running out of honey, 1934. Barn fire. Arranged cattle remains discovered, 1971. Dorothy Hartwell purchases property, 2024. I buy property. Fun note. The timeline suggested a pattern of recurring incidents, separated by years, but connected by the same underlying cause. Something about this land, or something in this land, that demanded appeasement. The honey, the rules, the careful maintenance of the seal on the well, all of it pointed to a community trying to contain something they couldn't destroy. My phone rang, shattering the silence. I jumped, nearly dropping it. The number was local, but unfamiliar. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Is this the new owner of the Hartwell place?" A woman's voice asked. She sounded elderly, her accent thick with East Texas drawl. "Yes, this is." "You found something, didn't you?" she interrupted. "Something hidden in the house. I can tell by your voice. You got questions now." My throat tightened. "Who is this?" "Name's Ida Brennan. I'm Thomas Brennan's great-great-granddaughter. I think it's time we talked about what you bought yourself into." The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, as morning sunlight streamed through the windows and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen despite the brightness. The Brennan family still existed. They were still here, still watching the property, and they knew I'd found the note. Whatever I'd stepped into was far from over. It had never ended. It had simply been waiting for the next person foolish enough to ignore the warnings, to think they could understand it, to believe they were safe just because the sun was shining and the world looked normal. But normal was a lie here. Normal was a thin veneer over something much older and much darker. I looked down at the note, at rule number 4. Thomas Brennan is not welcome on this property. If someone claiming this name appears, do not invite them inside. Do not speak to them. Leave immediately and do not return until 3 days have passed. Ida Brennan had called me. She'd known I'd found something. She wanted to talk. But was she trying to help? Or was this another test? Another way for this place to see if I'd follow the rules or let curiosity override caution. I had 3 days to decide whether to call her back. 3 days to determine if I was brave enough to seek the truth or wise enough to leave some questions unanswered. Outside, the ranch waited in deceptive tranquility, keeping its secret beneath the endless Texas sky. I didn't wait 3 days. I lasted 6 hours. The problem with knowing a truth exists is that ignorance becomes impossible. Every creak of the house, every shadow that moved wrong, every moment of unnatural silence screamed questions at me that I couldn't ignore. By noon, I was dialing the number Ida Brennan had called from, my resolve crumbling under the weight of needing to know. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. "Took you less time than Dorothy," she said without preamble. She waited 2 full days before calling me back. "You're either braver or more foolish. Haven't decided which yet. You knew Dorothy Hartwell?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Knew her 43 years. Helped her understand what she'd bought into. Same as I'm about to do for you. Though I'll tell you what I told her. Understanding doesn't make it easier. Sometimes it makes it worse." There was a pause, the sound of ice clinking in a glass. "You read the rules?" "Yes." "You follow them?" "I closed the windows last night." I heard singing. Ida made a sound that might have been approval or sympathy. "Then you know it's real. That's the first hurdle. Most folks convince themselves it's wind or coyotes, or their imagination running wild. But you heard it proper, didn't you? The old language. The song that's been sung out there for longer than white folks have been in Texas. What is it? I asked. What's singing? That's the wrong question, Ida said sharply. The right question is, what are you going to do about it? You're going to sell and run, or you're going to learn to live with it? I looked around my kitchen, at the boxes still unpacked, at the fresh start I'd imagined for myself here. I want to understand. Then meet me at the diner on Highway 71. 1 hour. Come alone, and for God's sake, don't tell anyone else about the note yet. There are folks in town who'd rather those rules stayed lost. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there, phone in hand, wondering what I was walking into. But the alternative, staying here with only questions and that note for company, felt worse than whatever truth Ida might reveal. The diner was a chrome relic from the 1950s, gleaming incongruously against the dusty Texas landscape. I found Ida in a corner booth, a woman in her late 70s with white hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that had seen too much. She looked up as I approached, studying me with an intensity that made me feel transparent. You look like someone who thinks he can handle this, she said as I slid into the seat across from her. That's good. Confidence helps. Overconfidence kills. A waitress appeared, and Ida ordered coffee for both of us without asking what I wanted. When we were alone again, she pulled a worn leather journal from her handbag and set it on the table between us. This belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Margaret Brennan, she said. Youngest daughter of Josiah. She lived on that property until 1923, and she wrote down everything. Things the official records won't tell you. Things the family try to forget. She pushed the journal toward me. You want truth? It's in here. But once you read it, you can't unknow it. I opened the journal, my hands careful with the fragile pages. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, but the words were anything but delicate. June 14th, 1884, began one entry that Ida had marked with a slip of paper. Thomas has gone too far. Father warned him about disturbing the well, about showing proper respect, but Thomas never believed in anything he couldn't see or touch. Last night, he took Father's tools and broke the seal the Reverend had blessed. We heard his screams from the house, watched him pull down into that hole so fast, it was like the earth swallowed him whole. Rebecca tried to save him. She reached in after him, and something grabbed her. She's alive, but she's not the same. Her eyes are wrong. She speaks in voices that aren't hers. Father says we have to seal the well again, stronger this time, and we can never speak Thomas's name in this house again. But I think it's too late. I think whatever was down there is loose now. My coffee arrived, but I didn't touch it. I couldn't stop reading. August 3rd, 1884, Rebecca is gone. She walked to the south pasture at sunset despite our warnings, drawn by voices only she could hear. We found her dressed the next morning, but no body. Father says she's with them now. He won't explain who them is, but Mother crosses herself every time someone mentions the south pasture. We're leaving offerings of honey at the back door now, every third Thursday, as the old families taught us. It seems to keep things calm. December 1884. The well is sealed. Father hired men from 3 counties away who didn't know our family or the land's history. They built the stone cover, and Reverend Matthews blessed it in Latin and other languages I'd never heard. Father made me promise to never let anyone open it, to pass that promise to my children and theirs. Thomas is down there. Rebecca is out there. And we're all here, trapped between what we've done and what we have to keep doing to survive it. I looked up at Ida, my mind reeling. This is impossible. Things like this don't exist. Ida finished. That's what Thomas thought. He was modern, educated, didn't believe in his father's superstitions. So he broke the seal to prove there was nothing to fear. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. You know what pulled him down that well? The same thing that's been on that land since before the Brennan family claimed it, since before the Karankawa and Tonkawa people try to live there and failed. Since before time meant anything to whatever waits in that ground. What is it? I whispered. Ida shook her head. Nobody knows exactly. The indigenous peoples called it many names. The hungry ground, the thing that waits, the singer in the darkness. They avoided that specific area, treated it as cursed. But white settlers didn't listen. Josiah Brennan didn't listen. He built his house right over their sacred boundary markers, turned their warning grounds into cattle pastures, and the land tolerated it for a while, until Thomas decided tolerance meant there was nothing to fear. She pulled out another document from her bag, this one a photocopy of an old newspaper article. Dallas Morning News, 1918. Notice the headline, Mysterious Exodus from Hartwell County Ranch. 3 families, all gone within weeks. The reporter who wrote this interviewed them. They wouldn't give details, just said the protection failed, and they couldn't afford more honey. Paper thought they'd gone mad from isolation, but they hadn't. They'd just run out of offerings. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were a negotiated peace treaty with something that predated human civilization in this part of Texas. The honey offerings, the sealed well, the prohibition on entering the south pasture after dark. All of it was designed to maintain a delicate balance between the human world and something else entirely. Why doesn't anyone destroy the property? Burn it down? Salt the earth? I asked. Been tried, Ida said grimly. Remember that barn fire in 1934? That wasn't lightning. That was Herman Kowalski trying to purge the land. He arranged dead cattle in a circle, doused everything in kerosene, and lit it all up. Thought fire would cleanse whatever was there. She paused. They found him 3 days later in the south pasture. He'd torn his own eyes out, kept saying he'd seen what was underneath, and couldn't bear to see anything else. A chill ran through me despite the diner's warmth. So we just live with it, follow the rules forever. That's what her deed really bought, Ida said. Not just land, a responsibility, a contract signed in blood by people long dead, but still binding on whoever lives there. Dorothy understood that. She followed every rule for 43 years and died peacefully in her sleep. Never had a single incident after she learned what she was dealing with. What about the children's laughter? I asked, remembering rule number 8. What does that mean? Ida's face darkened. That's Rebecca, still out there after all these years, still trying to come home. When you hear children laughing where there are no children, it means she's close to the house, close enough to be dangerous. That's when you leave for a day and let whatever's driving her lose interest. She's still alive, after 140 years. Alive isn't the right word. She's something else now, something that used to be Rebecca Brennan, but isn't anymore. The land took her, changed her, and sometimes it sent her back to see if anyone will break the rules and let her in. Ida finished her coffee. That's why Thomas isn't welcome. Not the original Thomas. He's long gone, broken and consumed in that well. But things down there can wear names like costumes. If something shows up claiming to be Thomas Brennan, it's testing you, seeing if you'll invite it in, speak to it, acknowledge it. Do any of those things, and you've given it permission to stay. I thought about the phone call, about Ida identifying herself as a Brennan. How do I know you're really Ida? How do I know you're not? Good, she interrupted, almost smiling. You're learning. But I called you, remember? You didn't invite me. I made contact first, and we're meeting off the property, in public, in daylight. The rules have exceptions for family who genuinely want to help. I've been helping steward that land for 7 decades, even though I'd never lived there myself. I'm the safeguard, the information keeper, the one who makes sure new owners know what they're dealing with before something happens. She closed the journal and pushed it across the table to me. Keep this. Study it. Margaret documented everything she witnessed over 39 years. It'll teach you things the rules can't say explicitly. When to be cautious, when to be terrified, when to just accept that some things will happen and you survive by not investigating them. What happens if I sell? I asked. If I just walk away? You could. But whoever buys it next might not find the note. Might not have someone like me to warn them. The last time that happened was in 1957. Family of 5 bought the place at auction. Didn't know about the rules. Within 3 months, only the father survived, and he spent the rest of his life in an asylum, screaming about honey and wells and singing that never stopped. I just stood, gathering her things. You seem like a decent person. I'd rather you learn to live with it than let it pass to someone who'll trigger another catastrophe. She left money on the table and headed for the door, then paused and looked back. One more thing. Next Thursday is the 3rd Thursday of the month. Don't forget the honey. Raw, unfiltered, from local bees if you can manage it. Set it out before midnight, and don't watch from the windows to see what takes it. Some knowledge isn't worth the price. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with the journal and a truth I couldn't escape. I sat there for another hour, reading Margaret's entries, learning the patterns of the thing that lived on my land. She never named it directly, as if naming would give it more power, but she documented its habits, its preferences, its anger when rules were broken. By the time I drove back to the ranch, the sun was setting. I watched it sink below the hills from my truck, parked safely in the driveway, and felt the atmosphere shift as darkness claimed the land. Somewhere in the south pasture, beyond the range of my headlights, I knew the singing would begin soon. Not for me, necessarily, just because it did, because it always had. Inside, I locked the south-facing windows and sat down with Margaret's journal, learning to read the language of a land that had never really been tamed, only temporarily appeased. And somewhere deep below my house, something ancient and patient continued its eternal wait, content for now with the bargain that had been struck so long ago. Content, but never satisfied, never sleeping, never forgetting what it was owed. The journal became my Bible over the following weeks. I read it cover to cover 3 times, memorizing Margaret Brennan's careful documentation of life on cursed ground. But reading about the ranch's history and experiencing it were entirely different things. The 3rd Thursday approached with the inevitability of a funeral, and I found myself driving to 3 different farmers' markets to find raw, unfiltered honey that felt appropriate for an offering to something older than human memory. The vendor at the last market, an elderly beekeeper with skin like worn leather, held up a jar to the light and nodded approvingly. "This is good honey. Pure. The bees make it from mesquite and wildflowers out past Miller's Creek." Then she looked at me more closely. "You're the one who bought the Hartwell place, aren't you?" Word traveled fast in small towns. "Yes, ma'am." Her expression shifted, something like pity crossing her weathered features. "My grandmother knew Dorothy. Used to sell her honey every month, special. Said it was for keeping things right out there. She carefully wrapped the jar in brown paper. Whatever you're using this for, don't skimp on quality. Some things know the difference." I paid her and left quickly, unsettled by how many people seemed to know something about the ranch without saying what that something was. The knowledge existed in sideways glances and careful word choices. In a way, conversations died when I entered the feed store and the wide berth people gave me at the post office. They knew. Maybe not the specifics, but enough to be wary. That night, I set the jar on the back porch step at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before midnight. I debated the timing. Did before midnight mean any time before 12, or as close to 12 as possible? Margaret's journal hadn't specified, so I split the difference and hoped for the best. Then I went inside, locked the door, and forced myself not to look out the windows. The urge to watch was almost overwhelming. What would come for the honey? How would take it? These questions burned in my mind as I sat in my living room, lights off, listening to the house settle around me. Midnight came and went. I heard nothing unusual, no footsteps, no scraping sounds, nothing that would indicate someone or something had approached the porch. At dawn, I checked. The jar was gone, not dropped or broken, not tipped over by animals. Simply gone, taken cleanly, leaving no trace it had ever been there. The wooden porch board showed no footprints, no marks, just empty space where I'd placed an offering to keep something I couldn't name satisfied for another month. With that first offering completed, I felt emboldened to dig deeper into the ranch's history. Margaret's journal mentioned several locations on the property that had significance, places where incidents had occurred, where the boundary between normal and abnormal grew thin. The south pasture was obviously forbidden territory after dark, but there were others. The burned remains of the original barn, a stand of mesquite trees near the eastern property line where Margaret had seen shapes that moved wrong, and most intriguingly, a small family cemetery that wasn't marked on any modern map. I found references to the cemetery in Margaret's entries from 1901, after her mother Eleanor had drowned. "Mother is buried in the family plot behind the oak grove," she wrote. "Father says it's important to keep the graves tended, to show respect. They're watching," he says. I don't know if he means the dead or something else, but I've learned not to ask for clarification when his eyes get that distant look. The oak grove wasn't hard to find. It was one of the few clusters of trees on the otherwise open prairie, a small stand of ancient live oaks that had somehow survived countless droughts and fires. I hiked out there on a cloudless morning, armed with work gloves and pruning shears, telling myself I was just maintaining the property. The cemetery was exactly where Margaret's descriptions suggested it would be, hidden behind the oldest oak. 6 headstones, simple limestone markers worn smooth by more than a century of weather. I brushed away the overgrowth and read the names. Josiah Brennan, 1832 to 1903, Eleanor Brennan, 1840 to 1902. William Brennan, 1872 to 1919, Margaret Brennan, 1875 to 1923, Rebecca Brennan, 1877 to 1884, Thomas Brennan, 1861 to 1884. The last 2 stopped me cold. Rebecca and Thomas both had death dates, both 1884. But according to Margaret's journal and Ida's account, neither of them had actually died, at least not in any conventional sense. Thomas had been pulled into the well. Rebecca had been taken by the south pasture. Yet here were their graves, their deaths officially recorded, their bodies supposedly interred. I knelt by Rebecca's stone, running my fingers over the carved dates. The stone was real, weathered and permanent. But was there actually a body underneath? Or was this grave a formality, a way to give closure to a disappearance that couldn't be explained? I wouldn't dig if I were you. The voice came from behind me, and I spun around so fast I fell backwards over William's headstone. A man stood at the edge of the oak grove, probably in his 60s, wearing work clothes and a sweat-stained hat. He held a shovel like someone comfortable with it, and his face was deeply tanned from years of outdoor work. "Sorry to startle you. I'm James Kowalski. I maintain the fence lines on the neighboring property." Kowalski, the same name as Herman Kowalski, the man who tried to burn the ranch in 1934. I got on my feet, brushing dirt from my jeans. "Are you related to Herman Kowalski?" His expression darkened. "He was my grandfather. I'm guessing you know what happened to him." It wasn't a question. "I've heard stories. Stories don't do it justice." James set his shovel down and approached the graves, his movement careful, respectful. Grandpa Herman thought he could fight it, thought fire and faith would drive out whatever lived on this land. He was wrong, and it cost him everything. My grandmother never spoke about what he saw that night, but she kept his journal. I read it once, when I was younger and stupider. Haven't been the same since. What did it say? I asked, needing to know, even as part of me recoiled from the answer. James looked at me for a long moment, measuring whether I could handle the truth. He wrote about faces in the fire, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all the people the land had taken over the years, all the way back to the tribes who first tried to settle here. They were screaming, but also laughing, and he realized they weren't being punished. They were part of it now, fed into something that had been hungry since before humans existed, and they'd become extensions of its will. He paused, his voice dropping. The last entry was dated the day before they found him. Just one sentence. It's not in the land. It is the land. The implication settled over me like a shroud. Everything I've been thinking was wrong. I've been imagining some creature, some entity that lived beneath the ranch. But if Herman was right, if his revelation before madness had any truth to it, then the entire property was the entity. Every acre, every blade of grass, every stone of the well. The land itself was alive and aware and hungry. Why do you work near here? I asked. If you know what it is, why stay? Because someone has to bear witness, James said simply. Someone has to remember. The Kowalskis used to own your land back in the 1920s. Lost in the Depression, and honestly, it was a relief to be rid of it. But we stayed close, keeping watch, making sure no one does something stupid that might wake it up more than it already is. Wake it up? You mean it's asleep? Not asleep. Dormant, maybe. Satisfied enough by the offerings and rules that it doesn't need to hunt actively. But there have been times when the bargain broke down, when people got careless or defiant. Those times, he gestured toward the graves. You end up with markers for people who aren't really dead, and deaths that can't be explained by any natural cause. I thought about the South pasture, the singing that came every night. The rules keep it calm. The rules keep it from getting worse. James corrected. Don't mistake compliance for safety. You're living on something that tolerates your presence as long as you feed it, respect it, and stay within the boundaries it's drawn. But tolerance isn't friendship. It's not even neutrality. It's just strategic patience. He picked up his shovel and turned to leave, then stopped. My advice? Do what Dorothy did. Follow every rule to the letter. Don't get curious. Don't investigate. Don't try to understand it beyond what you need to know to survive. And whatever you do, never, ever convince yourself you've got it figured out. That's when it takes you. After James left, I stood alone among the graves, thinking about Herman Kowalski's revelation. If the land itself was the entity, then everything I'd been planning, mapping the property, exploring every corner, truly making it mine, was dangerously naive. I wasn't buying empty acres to shape and develop. I was buying a living thing that had its own agenda, its own awareness, its own hungers that had been temporarily directed away from me by rules written in the blood of people who'd learned them the hard way. I spent the next week interviewing everyone I could find who had any connection to the ranch's history. Most were reluctant to talk, but the combination of persistence and the fact that I'd already found the note loosened some tongues. I spoke with the great-nephew of one of the 1918 tenant farmers, who remembered his great-uncle's nightmares about the honey keeper, something that came for the offerings but was never seen clearly, just glimpsed in peripheral vision as something too tall and too thin to be human. I found a granddaughter of the Reverend who'd sealed the well in 1891, who showed me his personal Bible. In the margins of Psalms, he'd written notes about performing a binding ritual of necessity, not faith, and how the evil he'd sealed predated sin itself, being neither fallen angel nor demon, but something older and more fundamental. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, but instead of clarity, I felt increasingly overwhelmed. The picture forming was of something so beyond human comprehension that giving it a name or shape was impossible. It was the hunger beneath all hungers, the darkness that existed before light was invented, the patient predator that counted time in millennia rather than moments. And I was living on top of it, separated from its full attention only by rules and offerings, and the thin hope that my compliance would be enough. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the ranch in shades of amber and shadow, I understood what Dorothy Hartwell must have felt. The strange peace that came from accepting an impossible situation. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't escape it. You could only follow the rules, make the offerings, and hope that when your time came to leave this world, it would be naturally rather than as nourishment for something that wore the land like skin. The singing started right on schedule as darkness fell. I no longer flinched when I heard it. I'd learned to accept it as just another feature of my new home, like the creaking floors or the temperamental plumbing. The voices rose and fell in their incomprehensible melody, and I closed the south-facing windows, locked them tight, and went about my evening. But that night, as I lay in bed reading more of Margaret's journal, I heard something new. Not singing. Laughter. Children's laughter, high and clear and joyful, coming from just outside my bedroom window. Rebecca had come home. I remembered rule number 8. Children's laughter heard when no children are present means you should leave the property for 24 hours minimum. Without hesitation, without even changing on my pajamas, I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and Margaret's journal. I was in my truck and driving away within 3 minutes of hearing that terrible, innocent laughter. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw something pale standing in my front yard, but I didn't slow down to look closer. Some rules existed for very good reasons, and I just learned why this one couldn't be broken. I checked into a motel 40 miles away and didn't sleep at all that night, wondering what was happening at the ranch in my absence, and whether I'd made a terrible mistake by running. But the alternative, staying and finding out what Rebecca wanted, was worse than any uncertainty. The land had tested me, and I'd passed. Barely. I returned to the ranch exactly 26 hours after I fled, driving back in full daylight with my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles white. The property looked exactly as I'd left it. The house standing solid and unremarkable, the pastures rolling away toward distant hills, the barn casting its long shadow across the yard. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing looked wrong. But as I walked through my front door, I knew immediately that something had been inside. The house smelled different. Not bad, exactly, but wrong. Like wet earth and old flowers. A scent that didn't belong in the dry Texas heat. Every south-facing window stood open despite the fact that I'd locked them before leaving. And on my kitchen table, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 dead butterflies. Their wings were intact, their bodies positioned with mathematical precision, creating a pattern that hurt to look at directly. I called Ida Brennan. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the relief in her voice when she heard mine. You left. Good. You're learning. There are dead butterflies on my table. 7 of them, arranged in a circle. A long pause. Don't touch them. Do you have a shovel? Yes. Bury them in the family cemetery, between Rebecca's and Thomas's headstones. Do it now before sunset, and when you're done, come back to town. We need to talk about what happened last night. An hour later, I was sitting across from Ida in her living room, a modest house on the edge of town filled with the accumulated memories of 7 decades. She poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and I realized for the first time how old she really was, how much this burden must weigh on her. The butterflies are a message, she said finally. Rebecca's way of saying she tried to reach you but couldn't. 7 is significant. It's the number of steps from the front door to the staircase in your house. She counted them, walked to where you should have been, and left a marker of her frustration. Why butterflies? Because that's what she was like when she was alive. Sweet, delicate, drawn to beauty. The land keeps some memories of who people were before it took them. It uses those memories as weapons, makes its servants seem familiar and safe. Rebecca appears as a little girl. The singing uses melodies from old hymns and lullabies. It wants you to lower your guard, to think maybe you can communicate with it, reason with it. Ida's eyes were hard. You can't. Whatever appears wearing familiar shapes is just the land fishing for mistakes. I thought about the laughter, how genuinely joyful it had sounded, how part of me had wanted to go to the window, to see who was out there, to maybe help a lost child. The realization of how close I'd come to breaking the rule made my stomach turn. Dorothy heard Rebecca 3 times in 43 years. Ida continued. Each time, she left immediately. Never hesitated, never questioned. That's why she lived old age. That's why the land let her die peacefully. She fixed me with a stare that felt like it could see through my skull. Do you understand what I'm telling you? This isn't about solving a mystery. It's about surviving one that can never be solved. But I couldn't let it go. Over the following months, I continued researching, compiling everything I'd learned into a comprehensive history of 447 Whiskey Creek Road. I mapped every incident, every disappearance, every moment when the rules had been broken and the price paid. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. The land operated on cycles. Every 7 years, there was an escalation, more incidents, more tests, more opportunities for mistakes. 1884 had been an escalation year, when Thomas and Rebecca were taken. So had 1891, when Eleanor drowned. 1918, 1934, 1953, 1974, 1995, 2016. And now we were approaching 2025, the next cycle year. I found records of each escalation hidden in old newspapers, court documents, medical examiner reports, always explained away as accidents, natural causes, or madness. But the pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Every 7 years, the land tested whoever lived there more intensely, as if it needed to confirm that its boundaries were still being respected. Dorothy had survived 6 escalation cycles. She'd known they were coming and had been especially vigilant during those years, following the rules with obsessive precision. Her records, which Ida showed me from Dorothy's personal files, detailed her strategies, extra offerings during escalation years, never spending nights alone on the property in those periods, keeping blessed salt at every threshold, even though the rules didn't mention it. She developed her own supplementary rules. Ida explained, showing me Dorothy's meticulous journals, things she learned through experience that helped during the dangerous years. Not replacements for the original 10 rules, but additions to them. I studied Dorothy's additions, finding wisdom in her paranoia. During escalation years, check every lock twice before sleeping if animals avoid a certain area. You should too never speak the names of the taken out loud after dark if you feel watched. You probably are. Go inside, immediately trust your instincts over your logic. The land can wait longer than you can. These weren't in the original note I'd found, but they represented 43 years of learning to coexist with something that wanted her gone. I started following them immediately, adding them to my own growing understanding of how to survive on cursed ground. But knowledge, I was discovering, came with its own price. The more I understood about the ranch, the more I felt its attention on me. Not threatening, exactly, but aware. Like I'd moved from being a passive resident to an active participant in whatever ancient game was being played here. I started having dreams of the well, of voices calling my name from underground. I'd wake up standing in my back door, hand on the knob, with no memory of getting out of bed. I told Ida about the sleepwalking, and her face went pale. That's new. Dorothy never mentioned anything like that. You're not just following the rules. You're thinking about them too much, analyzing them, trying to understand the intelligence behind them. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Stop. Stop researching. Stop trying to figure it out. Just follow the rules and live your life. The more you focus on it, the more it focuses on you. But it was too late. I'd crossed some threshold, invited too much scrutiny by my digging into the past. The land knew I was studying it, and it had started studying me back. Things escalated quickly after that. The kitchen faucet began running red twice a week instead of the once every few months Dorothy had documented. I'd let it run for exactly 7 minutes each time, watching rust-colored water spiral down the drain, wondering if it really was rust or something else. The singing from the south pasture grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes I could almost make out words in that alien language, phrases that made my teeth ache when I tried to remember them. And then there was the cellar. Rule number 6. The cellar door stays locked. You do not have the key. You should not seek the key. Nothing good remains down there. I never even found the cellar door in my months at the ranch. The house had no basement access that I could see, no exterior doors leading underground. But one night, I woke from a dream of falling to find myself standing in the pantry, holding a crowbar, with a section of the wooden floor pried up to reveal stone steps descending into absolute darkness. I found the cellar in my sleep, or something had guided me to it. The smell rising from below was the same wet earth and old flowers I detected after Rebecca's visit, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. And from somewhere in that darkness came a sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic and patient. Something down there was waiting, had always been waiting, would wait forever if necessary. I dropped the crowbar and ran, not out of the house. I'd learned that leaving in panic could be as dangerous as staying. But I sealed the pantry door with furniture, barricaded it, and didn't go near it until sunrise. In the morning light, I checked the floor. The boards were intact, showing no signs of having been disturbed. But the crowbar lay on the pantry floor, and my hands bore splinters that proved some of what I remembered had been real. I called Ida again. She listened to my story in silence, and when I finished, her response was simple. Sell. Get out while you still can. I thought you said. I know what I said. That was before you started sleepwalking, before you found the cellar. Something's changed. Maybe it's the escalation cycle coming. Maybe it's you specifically. But the land is taking more interest in you than it should, and that's never good. Dorothy survived because she was boring, predictable, easy to ignore. You're not. You're curious, and you're stubborn, and you're making yourself interesting to something that shouldn't find you interesting. If I sell, whoever buys it might not find a note, might not know the rules. That's not your responsibility. Ida said firmly. Your responsibility is to survive. Let me worry about the next owner. I've been doing this for 70 years. I'll make sure they get the information they need. But you need to get out before it decides you're more valuable as part of it than as a resident. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right. The ranch was in my thoughts constantly now, even when I was off the property. I catch myself planning offerings, mapping safe routes through the pastures, wondering what was really buried under Rebecca's and Thomas's markers. It was consuming me in a way that felt deliberately orchestrated, like the land was slowly digesting my identity and replacing it with something more compliant. That night, I made my decision. I'd sell the ranch and leave. I'd survived longer than most, learned more than I should have, and walked away while I still could. It wasn't cowardice. It was the wisdom Dorothy had taken 43 years to acquire, and I'd learned in 6 months. But the land had one final lesson for me. I was packing when I heard the knock on my front door. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. I approached cautiously, remembering rule number 4. Never invite anyone claiming to be Thomas Brennan inside. Never speak to them. Leave immediately if they appear. Through the window, I could see a figure standing on my porch. Tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that might have been from the 1880s. His face was in shadow despite the porch light, but I could see his mouth moving, forming words I couldn't hear through the glass. I'm Thomas Brennan, the shape said, and, even muffled by the door, the voice was wrong. Too deep, too resonant, like it was coming from somewhere much larger than the human-shaped thing on my porch. I've come home. Won't you invite me in? I grabbed my keys and ran for my truck. Through the windows, I could see the Thomas thing still standing there, patient and still, not trying to force its way in. It didn't need to. It was testing whether I'd follow the rules even when leaving, even in panic, even when every instinct screamed to just go. I drove to town and checked into the same motel where I'd stayed when Rebecca came. I didn't sleep. I sat up all night, thinking about what Ida had said, about Dorothy's 43 years, about Herman Kowalski's revelation that the land itself was the entity. The next morning, I called a realtor, listed the property for sale. In the description, I made sure to mention it was a unique property with specific maintenance requirements and suited for someone familiar with rural Texas ranching traditions. Coded language that I hoped would attract someone who might understand what they were buying into, or at least someone cautious enough to do research before moving in. The ranch sold within 3 weeks to a family from California who'd made money in tech and wanted to get back to nature. I met them once during the inspection and tried to slip them hints about being careful, respecting local traditions, and following any instructions they might find left by previous owners. They smiled and nodded politely, clearly thinking I was just another eccentric ex-owner with attachment issues. I wanted to tell them everything. I wanted to grab them by the shoulders and explain that they weren't buying land. They were buying a responsibility, a burden, a relationship with something that counted time differently than humans. But I remembered Ida's warning about letting her handle the next owners. She'd find a way to get them the information. On my last day at the ranch, I walked through the house one final time. It felt different now, less oppressive. The land knew I was leaving, and its attention had already shifted, waiting for the next resident. I made one final offering of honey, even though it wasn't a third Thursday. Just a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that I'd been a guest here and was leaving on good terms. As I drove away, I looked back at 447 Whiskey Creek Road in my rearview mirror. The house stood silent and patient under the enormous Texas sky, holding its secrets close. Somewhere in the south pasture, something was singing. In the family cemetery, stones marked graves that might or might not contain bodies. And deep beneath it all, sealed in a well that should never be opened, something waited that had been waiting since before humans had names for such things. I'd survived, learned the rules, followed them, and walked away intact. But I'd never be free of it entirely. Even now, hundreds of miles away in a new city with new routines, I sometimes wake up standing at my door, hand on the knob, drawn by voices singing in a language I shouldn't understand. And every third Thursday, without fail, I feel the urge to buy honey and leave it on my porch, even though there's nothing here that needs appeasing. The land let me go, but it kept something, a piece of my awareness, maybe, or just the knowledge that there are places in this world where the rules of reality are negotiable, where ancient things persist beneath the veneer of civilization, where survival depends on respecting boundaries drawn long before we arrived. I don't know what happened to the California family. I don't want to know. But sometimes I check the online news from that county, looking for stories about disappearances or strange incidents at a ranch on Whiskey Creek Road. So far, there's been nothing. Maybe they found the note. Maybe Ida reached them in time. Maybe they're following the rules and learning to live with something that can never truly be understood. Or maybe the escalation cycle is still building toward its peak, and the land is simply patient, waiting for the right moment to collect what it's owed. I hope they're safe. I hope they're smarter than I was. I hope they never find a cellar door or hear Rebecca's laughter or see something claiming to be Thomas Brennan standing on their porch in the dark. But hope doesn't change the nature of that place. The rules exist for a reason, written in the accumulated wisdom of people who learn through tragedy what happens when you break them. 10 simple rules that stand between survival and becoming another name carved on a well cover, another grave in a cemetery for people who aren't really dead, another voice added to the singing that rises from the south pasture every night without fail. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be survived. And survival means accepting that there are things older and stranger than human understanding. Things that wear the land like skin and wait with the patience of eons for someone curious enough or foolish enough to test the boundaries. I tested them. I survived. But I'll never forget what I learned in those 6 months at 447 Whiskey Creek Road. The land remembers everyone who's lived on it. It keeps them in one way or another. And someday, long after I'm gone, When someone else finds a hidden note and reads those 10 rules, they'll be reading instructions written in the accumulated sacrifice of everyone who came before, including me. Because even though I left, even though I followed the rules and got out alive, I left something behind. We all do. A piece of ourselves becomes part of that place, folded into its long memory, another warning for whoever comes next. If you ever find yourself looking at a property that seems too good to be true, too cheap for what it offers, too isolated and perfect, look closer. Ask why. Research the history. And if you find rules hidden in walls, take them seriously. Some bargains aren't worth making, no matter how wide open the spaces or how peaceful they seem in daylight. Because when darkness falls and the singing starts, you'll understand what peace really costs in places like that. And you'll wonder, like I still do, if you made the right choice. If running was wisdom or cowardice. If staying would have taught you something transcendent or simply destroyed you. The land doesn't answer those questions. It just waits, patient and eternal, for the next person to test the rules and learn their lessons the hard way. I hope you never find a place like that. But if you do, remember, follow the rules. All of them. Without exception, without question, your survival depends on it. And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough.